Okay, so much for general remarks. Now we get into the nitty-gritty of the modifications for oil control. This is a small block Chevrolet, as I said, but pretty much everything I'm going to say has applicability to the other American V8s out there to a greater or less extent. All right. The first thing we do is modify the block, and this is an early stage. You know, I do this before we even clean the thing for the last time or before you send it to the machine shop. It's just like that grinding you're going to do on the bottom end when you put a stroker crankshaft in for clearancing. It's just going to fill the engine block up with a lot of grit, and so you might as well do it as early as possible. Okay. Moving to the front of the engine here inside the timing chain cover, what you can see is there's this great big oil return hole. All right, you can see my push rods through there. And there's a smaller one on this side, and then there's, you know, one at the back of the block, right back there. Might be hard to see. This, of course, is where the distributor rides over here. Okay. Other than that, the oil returns to the bottom end from the top end through these oil return holes, which I've drilled and tapped. I'll come back to that in a minute. These are not actually epoxied in, or I don't have any thread locker on them yet because they're actually going to come back out. I have a reason for that. Okay, so these holes lubricate the camshaft lobes as the oil returns. And what we'd like to do, that is, this is something that the racers have been doing for years, is that we'd prefer the oil to return down the front of the block where it can't get entrained in the crankshaft, or directly down into the sump through the back of the block where, again, it has a good chance of missing the crankshaft and not getting caught up and whipped into that propeller windage. Okay, the problem is with these return holes, if the oil drops down, it does lubricate the face between the camshaft lobe and the lifter face, and that's wonderful for camshaft longevity, which is a big concern. But it directly proceeds, right, from the bottom of the camshaft into the crankshaft, and that's a problem. So this is all pretty controversial. I mean, a lot of people will say don't do this for the street, okay? And it's kind of an experiment for me. And I always experiment on small block Chevys because they're the cheapest. And if I wreck one, you know, it's not like I threw away a $10,000 bill, okay? By the way, speaking of the more expensive engines, like Pontiac has a very wide open lifter valley here, and you can see the crankshaft lobes very well, unlike this Chevy. A big block Chevy has a fairly wide open lifter valley. An Oldsmobile is more like this. It just has these 8 oil return holes or so, and a Pontiac has a very open valley too, and those are the ones I'm most familiar with. All the engines are open or not here to a greater or less extent. But with the Chevy, you've got an easy way to restrict oil and send it, you know, oil control. That means sending it where you want it to go. So in my case, what I want it to do is go to the back or go to the front, not get down on the camshaft, and thereby get to the crankshaft. Okay, so these restrictors, some guys just use a plain old set screw, which are cheap. And block that entirely. The circle track guys like to do that. This is more of a breather. It actually has a hole through it, and it lets the pressure in the crankcase escape to the upper crankcase here to equalize it. So, you know, you pays your money and you takes your choice there. Right? Okay. So what I do then is I port these oil return holes, and I know, I'm sorry, I apologize, my light isn't the best. Let's see here. Maybe you can see this a little better here if I shine a little light on it. Okay, as cast from the factory, the block does not encourage the oil to go out in that direction very well. The orifice has just got some flash on it, and it doesn't flow very well. So what I do is I take my die grinder and I just smooth that out. I lower the floor so that the oil will want to go that way. And of course, if your car's accelerating forward, a lot of the oil is going to want to go to the back of the block. So you've got to pay attention to that back hole as well. Okay. Other than that, what I do to the block is I just drill and tap these holes like I showed you earlier. I won't bother to show you again. All I'll say in passing is good tools make a difference. One of my offshore taps couldn't even finish one hole in this block, and I bought an $18 tap, and I went through all of them like butter. Okay, so, I never regret spending money on good tools. Okay, now, you're sending a lot of your oil through the push rods up into the top end. And if you've got a roller cam, of course, it really doesn't matter how much you restricted, especially a solid roller, how much you restricted that oil from falling onto those cam wheels, because they're doing the job. They're taking away so much friction on the camshaft surface. Okay. Now, in our case, with a flat tappet cam, what you're relying on is the oil that's dripping down out of the bottom of the lifter bores and splashing up from the crankshaft, from the side clearance of the connecting rods to oil the camshaft, right? So you're restricting the oil here, okay? Now, a lot of guys restrict oil by putting some kind of set screw with an orifice into the oil lifter galleys, the passages, or something like that. We don't do any of that here, right? Because we're building street cars. And Smokey himself said, I don't do that either. It all it does is provide a place for trash to collect in the block. And if you block up that lifter galley, you're going to regret that you did, okay? So there are other ways to do it. For example, you could use a push rod, which restricts the oil to the top end. What I've done is I've used a set of edge orifice lifters, right, which are solid lifters. This is a solid camshaft engine, mechanical camshaft engine, no hydraulics, right? And what they do is they restrict oil to the top end. It's about as simple a lifter as you can get. If you've ever pulled apart an engine and had a lifter fall apart on you, or break, or the circlip in it has failed or something like that, these are basically failure-proof lifters as far as the mechanical action is concerned, right? So edge orifice lifters send up about 25% less oil into the top end. Now, how can I get away with that? Well, for a couple of reasons, right? First of all, I've used a full needle-bearing rocker arm, okay? That is, they don't pivot on the ball, and so a lot less oil is needed. They're kind of self-lubricating. They need to be kept cool, of course, but a lot less oil is needed down there where it normally would be. And the other big thing I've done up here is I've used beehive valve springs. And you guys who know your Chevrolets recognize these as LS6 late model beehive springs that are a stock, and those LS guys, they take these out first thing and throw them away because they like to run big cams. But for our little old school Chevrolet with an LT1 1970 vintage slow ramp camshaft, I'm betting that these valve springs are going to work great. Now, they are not dual valve springs. You can probably just glimpse color inside there. I use some posi, what do they call them? Not Teflon, posi valve. On the valve stems for the oil control. I use the umbrella seal sometimes for the exhaust, because the exhaust valve stems live a very hard life, and exhaust valves get very hot. So sometimes you want a little oil going down onto that valve stem. But for the intakes, of course, which will suck the oil right in, you want, the Viton valve seals, right, is what I was struggling to remember earlier. Anyway, that's a distraction. What I mean to say is these valve springs are single valve springs. They don't have a damper. They don't have a secondary and a third spring inside. So they don't have anything rubbing together, creating friction to keep them under control. They're kept under control by a different means. They have ovate wire, and the harmonic frequency is ill-defined in a beehive valve spring. So bottom line, although they do need some oil, obviously all valve springs need some oil to keep them cool, they do need less. And so what I'm hoping is by restricting the oil that's coming up by about 25%, obviously that's going to mean less oil going back down. Combined with these top end mods that I talked about earlier, that's going to mean less entrainment of the oil, less parasitic losses in the crankshaft, and more horsepower. Okay. All right, now let's flip it over to the bottom end and look at the kind of race car stuff that has come down to us through time. All right, and let's see if I can do it without killing myself here. Okay, looks like the Midas touch was put upon this thing. Okay, I'm going to come back to it in a minute. Okay, as far as your bottom end is concerned, probably besides the pump and filter, right, your number one means of oil control is your oil pan. Now, some guys just kind of insist, or the budget calls for a stock oil pan, and there are reasons for that. I've got several on my bench here. Well, maybe I better keep it like this. Okay, the number one reason to stay, besides money, with the stock oil pan is the chassis fitment. Depending on what kind of car, for example, a small block Chevrolet, they've got different oil pans for Corvettes and Chevy 2 chassis versus, let's say, a Chevelle or a Caprice or a Camaro. You've got your steering linkage to think about. You've got the headers that are in the car, any other modifications you may have made, and you know, there's nothing worse than building a nice engine, and I've done it, try to put it in the chassis and it won't fit. So let's take a quick look at what you can get in oil pans here. None of these things cost really a lot of money. I mean, to me, it's just a good investment. There's a stock one, right? And what it's got is just one single baffle. Of course, a lot of stock oil pans come with nothing. They just hold the oil, no tricks whatsoever. Okay, this is a slosh baffle, and what it does is it prevents under hard braking your oil from surging forward and uncovering the pickup, which of course is the number one job of the wet sump oil pan. The oil pump pickup is going to stay right here, and it's going to have access to that full 5 quarts of oil or 4 quarts of oil, one in the filter, most of the time for the average V8. Okay, here what we've got, you can see the rail is so much higher. Right, this is a 4-inch stroke clearance oil pan with just a little more going on. It's got a much wider sump. It holds 8 quarts. And the idea here, you can see it's got a little bit of baffling. No trap door in here. Just the idea here is to hold more oil. That does 2 things primarily. That is, it keeps the oil cooler, of course, and it keeps the oil further away from the crankshaft, which is rotating. Okay, so more is better in this case. You could never really have too much oil in a wet sump system or a dry sump system for that matter. Dry sump system is an excellent other example of how the technology, the race technology, trickles down to the average guy. I've not seen one, but the new Corvettes, I'm told, have dry sump systems. Well, that's something that they were playing around with in the 60s. And they gladly dropped all this wet sump stuff the second that they could in NASCAR and things like that. As long as the class rules allowed it, a dry sump, which takes all the oil away from the crankshaft entirely out into a remote reservoir and pumps it back from there, is a much better way to run a race car because of all the centrifugal force, the braking force, that act upon that car, the high speeds around the track. Your oil in a wet sump system just wants to climb all over the place and basically be anywhere else but where it should be. Okay, now here's a big block Chevy oil pan that I had handy, and you can see this has got baffling in the back. It's got a couple of trap doors here in the front. It's got, I think this rail held a sort of half windage tray that I've removed. And this still has the break-in trash in it. So there's we're stepping up here in the technology. Back to small block pans here. This one's got the trap doors. It's got the big sump. It holds a lot more. It's a drag racing pan, and it's got a distinct angle down toward the back because when you drag race, all the oil should be thrown toward the back of the pan as well as possible. And one more big trick is that you can see this has got a kick out, what's called a kick out. Maybe you could see it best from this angle right here. That is, the crankshaft rotates clockwise in a small block Chevy, and the idea is that the crankshaft will throw off its oil into this kick out, and the solid wall is not there, so it can't let the oil bounce back off the sheet metal into the crankshaft when it just left it. And so that's one I'm saving for a later project. There's a lot of clearance in that pan, and I want to use it for a small block 427. Okay, back to our project here, which is, by the way, a 388 stroker. Okay, there are 3 bolt-on, or 4, I should say. There are 4 bolt-on modifications, and you don't need to worry about the budget, guys. I mean, this stuff is pretty cheap, and that's one of the advantages of the race car technology trickling down. Okay, first of all, you can see I've got my, like I said earlier, stock. That's a stock milling oil pump, right? Not a high volume. And you've got a bolt-on oil pan pickup there, which is that gold iridite. I don't care about that. You don't see any of this stuff, but that just seems to be a rust preventative surface that is, trending these days, they say. And as opposed to the stock oil pan pickup, you can see that it's got some extra height to it because it fits my oil pan. I like to have about 3/8 clearance here between this pickup and the bottom of the oil pan. Now the bolt-on feature is nice because for you guys who've done Chevy pans, you know that it has to be brazed or welded in so that it doesn't fall out. And of course, if you're being lazy and you don't disassemble the oil pump body and take the spur gears out before you do that, you can heat up the oil pump and damage it without realizing it. And you'll end up buying a new one, or worse yet, installing it in the engine and not knowing that it's not working well. So I like the bolt-on feature. At any rate, the oil control here comes from the fact that the pan is deeper and further away from the crankshaft. Back here, a little harder to see, and all these things have to be assembled in order, is a slosh baffle. You can see I use studs on my mains, which makes all of this a little bit more difficult. And I had to drill an extra hole or 2 here to make this work. This is a slosh baffle for the back of the oil pan. As far as the small block Chevrolet configuration is concerned, which is very different from, say, a Ford, where the oil pan pump is in the front, you can't really, the oil pan manufacturers can't really put much of a slosh baffle in the back of the oil pan, because it won't fit when you try to install the pan. It won't fit over the oil pump. And so somebody has devised this bolt-on one that goes in between the oil pump and the main cap, and that's meant to prevent, if this is upside down, so you have to kind of invert your thinking, but you can imagine when you take off in a drag race, for example, all the oil is going to the back of the pan, and it's trying to climb the back of the pan and get into the crankshaft where it shouldn't be, and that's meant to prevent that. By the way, you can use all these things together, or you can use them separately, whatever you believe in or whatever you can afford. You don't have to do them this way. Okay. Now next are 2 mods that work together. Okay. Remembering that the crankshaft is turning, in this case a clockwise direction at high speed, it's both throwing off a lot of oil, and that comes primarily through the side clearance of the connecting rods down there, right? That is, there's maybe 10 thousandths in this case clearance between those 2 rods. And because there's a lot of bearing pressure in there, oil pressure in the bearings and the journals, it spits out oil, and that lubricates the camshaft, as we said. But unfortunately, you can't control it very well, and it's always spitting oil in every direction, right? So these 2 mods are meant to take the oil that's coming back down from the bottom end and draining, and the nice oil comes in the front, as we said, and in the very back where it doesn't hit the crankshaft. But for the oil that won't cooperate, we've got these 2 measures. So one is called a windage tray, and this is called a diamond stripper windage tray, or a screen windage tray. The factory had windage trays that were just solid sheet metal. Pontiacs are famous for them. Chevys have them. Here's one. That's held on by studs from the main caps. And you can see that's a solid piece of sheet metal. Okay, I don't really care for those. I think it's better to have one than not to have one. But the problem with this, a solid windage tray is that the oil can come down and bounce back off it and go right back in the direction you don't want it to be in. And so in some cases the factory has made these smaller and eventually gotten rid of them. Guys in the past would take them when it was all we had and drill holes in them for the oil to drain out and not bounce off. But that was kind of a crutch for a problem. And so now we've got this. This is my preference. I've seen for small block Chevrolet, you can get all sorts of windage trays. You can get louvered ones that are solid but have a lot of holes where the oil can only go one way, like a jalousie window in a house. But I like these diamond stripper ones. So what you can not really see very well is the design here is so that the oil can only go in one direction. It can only come from the top of the engine down and through and back into the sump where it should be. But the oil that is over here in the sump and in the pan can't really get through it this way. And it's because of the really tiny design of the wire in the screen. It's a one-way set of it's hundreds of one-way orifices. So you bolt that on. It's not as easy as it may look, because you've got all these studs to deal with, and I had to invent the sort of standoff system. But there are other studs that you can buy, and it's a mechanical issue. You find ways to make it work. I've put windage trays in a lot of different kinds of engines, and adapted ones from big block Chevys into Pontiac, things like that. And you just figure it out. One of the issues you can run into is, where's your dipstick tube going to come through? And in this case, they've got they very kindly put a place for it to come through for you. Dipsticks can be a big issue in engine building that is just sort of the bane of your life. And you kind of need them, so you work it out. Now, the other part of the two mods that I was talking about is called a crank scraper. Okay. Now, a crank scraper bolts on. It's a piece of sheet metal. You could actually make it yourself if you have the means to cut sheet metal. And it goes about there. I've been working on this one, so it's not bolted down yet. It goes with when the oil pan goes on. It bolts to the oil pan rail. And what you can see is that's a very irregularly shaped piece of metal that literally strips off the oil from the crankshaft and the connecting rods as they rotate around. And this one, they're trimmed to fit, which means you don't want to just buy one of these and bolt it in there. Okay, it usually will take you a couple of hours of time, and I use a die grinder to make sure that my clearance is as tight as it could be. As those rods swing around, if I can get it, I'll take 20 thousandths of space between those rod bolts and this tray. And so it looks like something that's homemade, because it really is. It's very irregular. Every single tip on there has to be cut to match this particular engine, this stroke, these connecting rods. Of course, the guy that manufactured the thing, he didn't know what you were going to stick it in, besides it being a small block Chevy. So he could only make it so custom for you. Now, I really feel these are worth it. Again, the crankshaft is rotating clockwise in that direction. So what it does is it's throwing off a lot of oil into this tray, which gets returned to the pan. And then what it didn't throw off, that is clinging to the end of the connecting rods and these counterweights, can be stripped here before another rotation and return again down into the sump. So these two things together, which most engines don't have either of them, let alone both of them, are reputed by racers to pick up in the high RPMs a worthwhile amount of horsepower. I hate to throw a number because I don't know the number, but dyno tests have been done back to back with them and without them, and you can be sure that you're going to gain about 20 horsepower back from parasitic losses that you simply would have thrown away without these. Now, like any part that you add to a system that is not 100% necessary, you are adding a little bit of expense, but more importantly, you're adding a chance of something that can fail. And so these can be thick or thin pieces of sheet metal. This one's probably only about 20 thousandths thick. Of course, the thinner it is, the more chance that it'll fail. I haven't had one fail yet, but I haven't had to open up a lot of the engines that I've built yet, right? So when I do, and if I should find one destroyed, I'll go to a thicker one. But now the problem is, if you go to a thicker one, you can see that you've got an issue with leak control, right? Speaking of oil control, right? I guess leaks are a kind of subdivision of that too. And for small block Chevy guys, we love those one-piece oil pan gaskets. We don't have to fool around with the end seals anymore, and they're impregnated with metal, so you can't crush them or over-torque them. But what I have found, guys, this is a hot tip, is that if you're going to run a crank scraper, they, of course, do make your oil pan rail sit a little bit unevenly from the other side of the block, and they can cause leaks with that kind of one-piece rubber or metal impregnated oil pan gasket. So I have found that in several different makes of engines, that the old cork cheap oil pan 4-piece gasket that comes with your full gasket set is the one that likes to play better with this than anything else. What I do is I'll take my gasket sealer, I'll make sure this is perfectly clean and dry, this oil pan rail, this too, and I'll glue it down exactly where I want it about a half an hour before I put the oil pan on. When I'm sure that that's set up, I run my bead and I run my cork gaskets all over it, being as careful as you always are, putting the extra bit on the corners, the blobs, and not using too much, of course, is the key. Too little is much better than too much as far as gasket sealers, in my experience. And then I put it on, and I haven't had, knock on wood, I haven't had one leak yet. Okay. So I think that about wraps up the subject of oil control. I'm not getting into the higher echelon stuff today, like blocking off your oil bypass, dry sump systems, high dollar stuff, race car stuff. I'm not getting into any of that. To me, this stuff, I want to say that all the modifications that you're looking at right now, oil pan pickups can be a little pricey, but I don't think there's $150 worth of added hardware here beyond your normal budget. And that's about the cheapest horsepower you're going to get. As far as the stuff on the top end, the beehive springs, the roller rockers, all that stuff's a little more expensive. The edge orifice lifters, you're talking, more like $1,000 for things like, if you add all that up. But of course, you can do everything you're looking at here without doing any of that stuff either. To me, nowadays, having access, I wouldn't build an engine without at least, out of the 4 pieces that we're looking at here, at least 2 of them, plus an oil pan. I'm never going to just use a stock oil pan again in my life. I just don't see the point in doing it when you've got access to all this stuff. Even for you Oldsmobile guys, your Buick guys who can't buy good oil pans, or they're $500 for the good ones, and you don't want to spend that. You can do modifications to your own oil pans as well. You can at least put slosh baffles in them. You don't have to put trap doors in them, but you can take them to a fabricator if you can't do it yourself, and at least a crank scraper, or a windage tray. It really is not. It's a little time consuming, but it's not a huge amount of effort to put in some kind of windage tray to most engines. All right, fellas. That's it for today. Thanks a lot.